Welcome to Editors on Editing. I'm your host, Glenn Garland. Joe Walker has worked as a composer, a sound editor, and a film editor, but it's his brilliant work on Harry Brown and Life in a Day, as well as his collaborations with filmmaker Steve McQueen on Hunger, Shame, and 12 Years a Slave, for which he is nominated for the BAFTA, the Eddie, and the Academy Award that have brought him to the forefront of his craft. Thank you so much for being here tonight, Joe.
Thank you.
So I was wondering how you and Steve McQueen ended up working together in the first place.
We met on interview for Hunger, which is his first feature film. I read the script and I really wanted to do it. Hunger was this amazing opportunity to look at something dispassionately. I don't think it paints either side as good or bad. I mean, I think it's clear what was going on in that prison, but it's almost like in a Petri dish.
And I feel like most of Steve's movies have that dispassionate quality about them. I mean, 12 Years a Slave, you definitely identify more with the slaves, but you still get the sense that there was this sort of reasoning that had been perpetrated through the culture.
I mean, I feel sorry for many of the characters in that piece. I mean, the Epps household, there's no child. So there's a horrendous kind of repression of his feelings for one of the slaves that results in violence. He's a complex man. He's a horrendous man, but he's, shown in full light.
So was it in the script to start the narrative midway through where he's a slave and then you flash back to him as a free man? What was the choice there?
That was like an evolution. There were various pressures that we felt we needed to obey, and one of them was to get to Louisiana more quickly than we did. But there was also an imperative to try and immerse ourselves in the slave experience. And then having decided to sort of change the timeline, seeing some things in the rear view mirror are more effective emotionally than seeing them in a straight line. A good example of that was that Eliza, who loses her children in the slave market. Originally, her backstory, which was that she'd been the master's favorite and she'd borne the master a daughter, she told the story in the slave pen and then they all were packed off into the steamboat and went to Louisiana. And then transplanting that to after the moment where she's dragged
much more
off.
Effective there.
And as she leaves, he thinks back to this moment where she told the story and she starts with this huge beaming smile talking about the fine clothes she used to wear. Lots of those decisions, having decided to loosen up the timeline and play it differently, things suddenly started going well. There was a very late one, which was Solomon Waking in Chains, which we always thought would have a kind of incredible, dramatic
effective
sort of
cutting back and forth.
You're like him. It's happening ahead of time.
Hamilton, we must hurry.
One too many libations. Halfway there.
There's a lot of thought also put into all the transitions throughout. Or they say cheers.
Cheers. Cheers.
And then it's just such a quiet, intense cut to a close-up of him and you don't know where you are. And then slowly you reveal that he's chained. It's very effective.
Nobody will appreciate this, but this is something that keeps me happy. At the beginning of the film, he is in bed with his wife and he leans over and blows the candle out. And the sound of his sleeve rustling that they recorded on set, I used the same sound so that when he woke up in chains, the association, if anybody would pick it up, it would be on some deep level, that he turns up, he turns over in the morning expecting his wife. And then click, he finds the chains.
Wow. I felt that with all those quick close-ups when he's stringing his instrument at the very opening. Was the intention of having those close-ups when he destroys the violin to sort of echo back to?
Yeah, there's lots of echoes in the film. For example, the masked ball. We had this idea relatively late. We were thinking this is really a time for Solomon to be longing for his family. And we came up with the idea of a very simple pickup, which was him scratching the names on the side of the violin, so that when you cut to him and he has the violin crooked under his neck, we know what he's thinking about. And
it echoes that earlier time when he was the maestro. He gets off the steamship and he sees these guys with the masks on, and you flash back to him getting the wallet. Tell me about placing that there.
And I have, the great weapon of Chiwetel's fantastic face on the dockside, and I had lots of shots where we could sort of pin that thought. And also, we're on a dusty harbour side, and the wheel that brought us into the shot just felt organic. And one understood how little he'd known or how little he'd imagined of a slave's life. In retrospect, much better than you would do as a first encounter.
Sure. Another scene that I thought was incredibly cut together is when Tibbets is singing
Yeah.
and then you start intercutting.
The idea
was it
of-
always going to be intercut with
No.
those various things?
No, not at all. Steve came up with this amazing idea of him singing this taunting song and getting the slaves to clap along. It's a real earworm when you're working on it in the cutting room. It's in your head for days.
Because
You know,
it has this rhythm. It's like, and
It's
everyone's
catchy,
clapping. it's
horribly catchy,
Yeah, and it almost seems like Solomon, because you keep playing the song
Yeah.
on his close-up, he's got this ringing in his ears.
I am the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob.
Precisely, and it meant that a scene that was shot purely as a kind of an establishment of Ford's character, that he'd read the Bible. We ended up sort of colonizing that with this counterpoint, and that there's such a horrendous mismatch.
Most of the films that you guys have worked on have this poetic, almost lyrical quality to them.
Sean Bobbitt, the DP, and Steve have worked together for a long period. They joined at the hip. There's a certain choice that they make about how they shoot, which hands me great benefit because everything is incredibly concentrated. They prefer long takes as and when they can do it. And certainly for key scenes, they were always planned to be long, sustained takes.
If there's something wrong, it's wrong with the instruction. Black bastard.
And that's, look, that's the key thing an editor can play with. You play with performance, you play with sound and picture, but you also play with time. I mean, the hanging scene is the big example of that. Nobody is able to cut him down apart from the master who's away. So he's left to dangle in the mud.
Oh, that close-up of his feet in the mud, and then you hold on that wide shot. It's very intense.
So he had this idea that the slaves would drift past like ghosts while this poor guy is just dangling. How do you stop it feeling like artistic indulgence to hold on to this shot? You foreshorten time before and after. He's waiting for the people to come and lynch him, and we don't show every step. We don't see the horses arrive all the way. We don't see him being bound. It was shot, but we didn't use it. We compress time, we drag him there, and then when he's strung up, it's happening too fast. So
Interesting.
you're ahead.
And then that allows the audience to sort of sit on those shots and sort of catch up emotionally.
Sound goes quiet. It's just the sound of him trying to catch his breath through a noose, and the sound of his tippy toes on the sticky mud, and then the swells of the cicadas come up and down and rise, and then it becomes a sort of rather beautiful, surreal sequence. There's some children playing just out of the reach of his neck. You compress time before that event, but we also compress time after the event. He's hacked down, and the cut is to a wide shot of Solomon on his back facing away from us in this stately hall. Play things at length and then put a very hard edge on it. So, that cut substitutes the falling on the ground shot that we imagine took place. And we've pushed ahead in time, and he's been told that he's been sold to somebody who's a slave breaker, and then bang, big close-up, contrast from a dark room to a very light shot of Epps, and it's a tracking shot that goes round with his wife in the background, so you sense her, you don't see her because she's going to come out a few moments later and whack somebody with a carafe, and then you'll surely know who she is. And you're sort of playing with sharp contrast between very light and very dark. The shot of the embers of his letter cutting to brightness and your searing heat.
Sun gon' set here.
There's a really lovely little cut, which I'll credit Steve for completely, where he's chasing Solomon around.
I'll cut your black throat!
Master!
And there's a brilliant moment where we just go from Solomon, we cut to Epps already running. So they're standoff, and you're expecting when you come back to Epps that he'll start to run. But we actually came with him, 3 steps in.
I brought her back just like you.
And the effect is, it's this sort of really alarming violence in
Sure.
the man. And when we put it together, you go, wow, suddenly you're
It's
on
very
edge.
scary.
Master out!
We were using things like the cicadas as a kind of orchestral score. And the rise and fall of them is very interesting. When we were down in Louisiana, you know, in the evening they sort of go into the zzz, 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 which just seemed to go with his insanity. It's deafening. I mean, it is technically deafening.
How involved are you with the sound and that sort of
Very. I mean, I find it very hard to cut without perfecting the sound, you know, to bring out the rhythms of the piece.
Another scene that I thought was really horrific and effective is where Solomon, he's told by Mistress Epps to go get supplies.
Yeah.
And you think maybe he's considering trying to make an escape.
You know, one of the kind of early responses you felt about Solomon was he was noble, but there's also an element of slight frustration. You know, why doesn't he pick up a gun? We hopefully show the process. You know, they're denuded, they're separated, they're given a different name, they're completely set against each other, and more to the point, if they go outside of that circle, then they're so visible from their skin that, you know, that they're on the run, and there's a far more excruciating, you know, consequence of that.
It's also powerful to see them being hung in the one shot.
You know, actually, the film is really restrained.
But it feels more horrific because it's restrained.
And because you care about the people it's happening to.
True.
Steve, he had this book, which was a book of postcards that people had taken of lynchings. Can you believe? In the book, on one side, you'll see the decimated bodies of two brothers. This is where the idea came from. And they've been burnt as well. And on the back, somebody had written, "Went to a fantastic barbecue last night."
Ah.
You know, it's sick.
Yeah.
Louisiana's I found it a very ghostly place. I'm not particularly sort of sensitive to that, but I felt it was, you know, there was a tremendous weight of, you know, human cost in that place.
Do you think that influenced you while you were editing it?
Well, it certainly kind of felt the pressure of telling this story that hasn't been told that many times. And just to do the best job that we could.
There's a matter-of-factness sometimes about the narrative where nudity is just shown very stark when Patsy gets the bottle thrown at her.
Actually, the key ingredient in that sequence is a close-up. You see the sharp edges and the weight of it, and then she throws it.
So if you didn't have that, it wouldn't have had so much weight.
You wouldn't have gone, ouch.
The scene where Epps sleeps with Patsy. It's all tight, but sometimes we're off of Patsy and just on Fassbender while he's choking her.
Yeah.
You were sort of holding back information and it made it more horrific. It's just so well put together. Tell me about that.
Oh, God bless you, thank you. His particular close-up was very inspired, you know, just a very inspired performance, you could just tell. And I think the choice was just to try and capture that moment where, you know, he's raping her and yet he's crazy enough to kind of reach out in tenderness to her. There's sort of massive contradictions in his head, and it was actually just really clear, you know, when you saw the rushes that we needed to do this way.
What about when Patsy comes to Solomon to take her life?
No, I didn't hurry, you know, I didn't hurry. And also there's a disease in editing, which is that you have to see every line in sync, you know. And sometimes hearing the line and seeing it play on another person's face is just so much more powerful, you know, power of reaction. The whole intention is just to invest, you know, allow the audience to invest in the inner life of the characters. And you can't do that.
If you're cutting too much.
If you're cutting too much in a scene like that. There's almost something in the subconscious that is telling the audience you're not watching a film, you're sort of watching reality. You'll be just putting a frame around something that really happened, and we're just going to look at it, and we're going to hold it long enough for you to be uncomfortable enough that you want to kind of get up and stop it, you know? And when the cut comes, you've got a choice of whether it's an attack or some release.
Well, there's that fantastic scene where Epps comes to Solomon about whether he's writing fancy letters.
Well, boy, I understand. I gotta learn a nigger that writes letters. Tries to get white fellas to mail them.
That's a classic Stephen Shawn. They intended to shoot it like that, and they shot it like that.
And did they shoot close-ups?
No.
No.
Not in that case. They got it. They knew they got it. And then when you come into the cutting room, it sort of hands you this great benefit. If you're going to avoid cutting, then the cuts are as sharp as a Damascus sword. And with the thread of violence around the corner, it hands me this great benefit that I can be very, very rhythmic. It's the same attitude towards music, which is, if you don't overuse it, it makes a real statement when you do.
It's all a lie. I'll be damned. Were he not free and white, Platt? Were he not free and white?
The dialogue in that is fantastic, but then lots of the story we're choosing to trim down as many words as we can possibly get away with, and then try to play things as non-verbally as possible. It's just the most powerful way of telling stories. You know, it's sensory cinema.
I noticed that that's something that you guys do a lot, and maybe that's what makes the films very lyrical and poetic, is that there is like this sort of stripping away this economy of words.
I'm not prejudiced against them, but, you know, I grew up in, you know, as a composer, and I was always much more drawn to the instrumentals than I was the lyrics.
You hold a very long time when they're walking back to Epps's plantation. Tell me about that.
The idea of that scene was to give it time to kind of feel Solomon's pain at returning, to also telling the story that there's cotton as far as the eye can see. And then,
Well, I noticed that there's a lot of times where you get into Solomon's head throughout the whole movie.
12 years, the big journey in the cutting room was trying to kind of sharpen what's going on in his mind, and certain choices you can make in the cutting room which help that. And Steve, you know, is so expert at this. But things like, for example, he joins in a song, Roll Jordan Roll, but at the beginning of the shot he doesn't join in. He's never seen himself as one of them. And I think there's a very definite step in his character, and it's just visible by that choice of how do you play it and how long do you play it before he changes. And when he does change, you know, you pick the take where he sings with passion.
Roll, Jordan, roll. Roll, Jordan, roll. My soul arise in heaven, Lord.
Another shot that was very effective was where Solomon, at the end, has given maybe his death warrant to Brad Pitt's character. And that one shot on his face for, I think it's almost a minute and a half. I don't know if that was meant to be there or if that was something that you had found in the dailies, and then suddenly you cut to the field with the hoe coming down. It really jolts you.
At the time, the reasoning behind that shot was this. It was an afterthought.
I was wondering about that.
We don't want to put up chevrons that say 1846, because if you're halfway through the film and you've only done 3 years or something, then it's not going to help, you know.
I was actually happy that you guys chose not to do titles, because I thought that the titles actually would have made the audience feel much more comfortable.
What's the best clock? And the best clock is Chiwetel's face. It was to look at the despair. And there's also, I think I noticed sort of retrospectively that we'd sort of tailed the sound down just before the cut. I've realised I do it quite a lot, and it sort of feels almost a bit like when two people are on the street and they're fighting. You know, when they stop talking, you know that somebody's going to swing a punch. And sort of tailing the sound down towards the end just felt like, you know, a semicolon, but also expecting a punch.
It's interesting that you say that, because my grandfather was a concert violinist with the Chicago Symphony.
Wow.
And he would always play this one piece where he'd go dun 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 dun.
Surprise symphony.
And it would get quieter and quieter and dun dun dun. And then he'd suddenly go, "Whoop." He lulled you into this sort of almost sleep-like state and then hit you so hard. And I feel like that's very
exactly
similar.
what we're doing. The man who comes back home and says after 12 years, "Forgive me." You know, just trying to capture that. Every
Honest
shot of that
close-up.
sequence tore me up when I saw the dailies. I remember that very, very well. I had to shut the door, you know.
Well, thank you so much
Great
for
pleasure.
your time. This was fantastic.
Nice one, thank you.